At its peak, the Mongol Empire controlled more land than any empire in human history, before or since. Roughly 9 million square miles, nearly a quarter of the entire planet's landmass, ruled by descendants of a single man who, a century earlier, had started out as an outcast teenager with no horse, no army, and, according to his own oral histories, nothing but a wooden cart to his name. They conquered China. They conquered Persia. They conquered Russia, Korea, and most of the Islamic world, sometimes in the same decade. Cities that refused to surrender were, on occasion, erased so completely that irrigation systems built up over 1,000 years never fully recovered. This was not a subtle empire. And within roughly a century of reaching that peak, the whole thing was broke, fractured, and hemorrhaging territory faster than it had ever conquered it. Not defeated in one battle. Not toppled by a rival superpower. It went broke. Actually, technically, financially broke. Printing money couldn't back, running deficits it couldn't close, and losing the loyalty of its own population because the paper in their pocket stopped being worth anything. The most feared military machine in world history didn't fall to a stronger army. It fell to bad accounting. And that somehow is the funnier version of the story. To understand how the Mongols went broke, you first have to understand that for most of their existence, the Mongol Empire didn't really have an economy in the way we normally define one. It had a conquest machine, and the conquest machine paid for itself. Genghis Khan's early campaigns worked on a model that was brutally simple and, for a while, brutally effective. You attack a wealthy settled civilization. You take its treasury, its livestock, its skilled artisans, and often a healthy percentage of its population as forced labor or slaves, and you use that plunder to fund the next campaign, which produces more plunder, which funds the next one after that. This is, in a very real sense, a Ponzi scheme with horses. It works spectacularly well as long as there's a next city to conquer, and the returns on each new conquest are large enough to cover the cost of getting there. And for the first several decades of Mongol expansion, that was exactly the case. The targets kept getting richer. The Khwarezmian Empire, the Jin Dynasty, the Song Dynasty, the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad, one of the wealthiest cities on earth at the time, fell in 1258, and its plunder alone reportedly took days just to catalog. But here's the part nobody in Karakoram was thinking hard about in the middle of a winning streak. A model that depends entirely on continuous expansion has exactly one built-in expiration date. Eventually, you run out of new wealthy civilizations within horseback range that haven't already been conquered. By the time of Kublai Khan in the late 13th century, the empire had stopped being a single functioning unit and had effectively split into 4 separate khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia and the Steppe, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, nominally connected by shared ancestry, practically operating as increasingly independent and increasingly rival states. This wasn't a footnote. This was the empire's core administrative problem, dressed up as a family arrangement. For khanates meant 4 separate treasuries, for separate military budgets, and, critically, for separate sets of cousins who, with growing frequency, found it easier to fight each other than to cooperate. Kublai Khan, ruling from China as the founder of the Yuan dynasty, inherited by far the wealthiest chunk of the old empire, but also inherited a problem none of his predecessors had ever really had to solve. How do you fund a government that isn't primarily funded by fresh conquests anymore? Because by Kublai's era, the easy, nearby conquests had mostly already happened. What remained were harder targets, further away, with diminishing returns, including, notably, 2 spectacularly expensive and spectacularly failed invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, both of which were devastated by typhoons the Japanese would later, somewhat smugly, name kamikaze, divine wind. 2 full naval invasion fleets, gone, along with the soldiers, the ships, and an enormous chunk of the treasury that built them. 0 plunder returned. That's not just a military failure. That's a budget line with nothing but negative numbers on it. So Kublai Khan needed cash, and conquest wasn't reliably supplying it anymore. His solution, adopted from earlier Chinese dynasties but expanded to an unprecedented scale, was paper currency, the jiaoqiao. Instead of coins backed by precious metal, the Yuan government issued paper notes that were, in theory, backed by reserves of silver held in the treasury and redeemable on demand. On paper, pun fully intended. This was actually a clever innovation. Paper currency is lighter, easier to transport across a continent-spanning empire, and easier to standardize than a chaotic mix of regional coinage. For a while, it worked reasonably well, and it made Kublai's government one of the more sophisticated monetary systems on Earth at the time. Marco Polo, visiting the Yuan court, reportedly found the entire concept of paper money backed by a bureaucratic stamp so strange he described it to European audiences almost like alchemy. Paper turned into wealth by government decree. The alchemy metaphor turned out to be more accurate than flattering. Because paper currency only holds its value if the government resists the extremely tempting shortcut of simply printing more of it whenever expenses run high, and the Yuan government, facing mounting military costs, expensive infrastructure projects, and a court accustomed to lavish spending, did not resist that temptation, not even a little. As military campaigns kept draining the treasury, further wars in Vietnam, in Burma, continued unrest across the empire's fraying edges, the government leaned harder and harder on the printing press to cover the gap between what it was spending and what it was actually collecting in taxes, which is, to put it in modern terms, the exact move every economics textbook uses as the textbook example of how to wreck a currency. The mechanism here isn't complicated. Even if the 13th century Mongols didn't have modern economic vocabulary to describe what was happening to them, print more currency without a corresponding increase in actual goods, silver reserves, or economic output, and every existing unit of that currency becomes worth less. Prices rise, wages don't keep up, and the people holding the currency, which, under imperial system, was essentially everyone required to use it, since alternative currencies were often restricted or banned outright, watched their savings quietly evaporate. By the mid-1300s, the Jiao Chow had been devalued so severely through repeated overprinting that the paper currency system, once Kublai's genuinely innovative fiscal tool, had become something close to a running joke, and not the funny kind. Reports from a period describe prices for basic goods rising so dramatically that some transactions reverted to barter or to using rice and grain as functional currency instead, because at least rice didn't lose half its value while you were still carrying it home from market. Here's the part that should sound uncomfortably familiar if you've ever read about any currency collapse in modern history. Once people stop trusting a currency, they don't wait around for the government to fix it. They act rationally on their own, immediately, hoarding real goods, refusing paper payment where they can get away with it, and quietly pulling their economic activity out of a system that's visibly failing. Which, of course, further starves a government of usable tax revenue, which pushes them toward printing even more currency to cover the shortfall, which makes the whole thing worse. It's a spiral. It has always been a spiral. The Mongols were simply one of history's earlier, larger-scale demonstrations of exactly how that spiral works. Currency collapse wasn't the empire's only fiscal headache, and it's worth being fair to Kublai Khan and his successors here. They weren't simply bad at money. They were trying to fund something genuinely unprecedented, administering the largest contiguous land empire in human history, long after the plentifunded expansion phase had ended. The Yuan government maintained an enormous relay and postal network, the YAM system, with tens of thousands of horses and way stations stretched across the empire to move messengers, officials, and goods at speed, a genuinely impressive piece of infrastructure, and an extremely expensive one to maintain continuously, indefinitely, without the fresh conquest revenue that had originally justified building at that scale. Add to that the cost of maintaining a large standing military across multiple fronts. Because an empire this size, even once expansion had largely stopped, still needed to constantly defend and resuppress restless provinces, which is its own continuous expense that produces no plunder in return, only cost. Add lavish court spending, elaborate construction projects, including a new capital, and periodic famine relief and flood control efforts along China's rivers, which, while genuinely necessary and not remotely optional for a government trying to maintain legitimacy, were also enormously expensive and produced no direct financial return. None of these expenses were individually unreasonable for a functioning government to take on, but stacked together, funded by a shrinking real tax base and an increasingly worthless currency, they were the fiscal equivalent of running multiple large mortgages on income that was actively shrinking every quarter. Here's where the financial crisis stops being an abstract accounting problem and starts becoming an actual political emergency. Because currency collapse doesn't just hurt a government's balance sheet. It destroys the basic social contract that keeps a population cooperative. Peasants across Yuan China, already burdened by heavy taxation and forced labor demands, including, notoriously, mandatory conscripted labor to repair the Yellow River after catastrophic flooding in the 1340s, watched their government simultaneously demand more from them while the currency they were paid and taxing became a punchline. That combination, worthless money plus rising extraction, is about as reliable a recipe for popular uprising as exists anywhere in history, and 14th century China was no exception. Starting in the 1350s, a series of uprisings collectively known as the Red Turban Rebellion spread across Yuan territory, drawing together peasants, disillusioned local officials, and opportunistic regional strongmen, all capitalizing on a government that had lost both financial credibility and, increasingly, basic administrative control over its own provinces. One of the leaders to emerge from this chaos was a former peasant and Buddhist monk named Zhu Yuanzhang, a man who, in a detail that has a certain poetic justice to it, would go on to found the Ming Dynasty in 1368, the government that finally, formally, ended Yuan rule in China. The Mongols, who had once conquered essentially the wealthiest empire on the planet through sheer battlefield dominance, were, within a century, pushed out of it by peasants who'd simply had enough of being paid in what amounted to colorful scrap paper. It's worth being clear this wasn't purely a China-specific embarrassment. The broader Mongol imperial system was fracturing along similar financial and administrative fault lines across nearly all four khanates simultaneously, even if the specific triggers varied. The Ilkhanate in Persia faced its own severe fiscal crises through the early 14th century, including, notably, its own experiment with paper currency, the chow, introduced in 1294 under Ilkhan Gekhantu, directly copying the yuan model. It was, if anything, an even faster failure. Merchants in the breeze reportedly refused to accept the new paper currency almost immediately. Trade in the city ground to a near halt within days, and the entire experiment was abandoned within roughly 2 months. If you're looking for the single fastest currency collapse in recorded medieval history, that's a strong contender. And it happened because a government tried to force an entire trading city to trust paper that had given them no real reason to trust. The Golden Horde, ruling over Russia and the Western Steppe, faced its own decline through succession crises, the devastating impact of the Black Death sweeping through its trade routes in the 1340s, and the gradual rise of Moscow as a rival power that would eventually, by the late 15th century, throw off Mongol overlordship entirely. The Chagatai Khanate fractured into competing factions and eventually split outright. None of the 4 khanates that split off from the original unified empire made it to the 15th century in anything resembling their peak-era form. An empire that had once seemed genuinely unstoppable on the battlefield turned out to have 4 separate, simultaneous financial and administrative failure points, once the conquest money stopped flowing in. Here's a detail that makes this whole story worth telling with a straight face and a raised eyebrow at the same time. The Mongol Empire is, without much exaggeration, the most successful military conquest operation in recorded human history. Nobody seriously argues otherwise. Their tactical innovations, their logistics, their sheer territorial reach, these are still studied in military academies today, 8 centuries later, and they were undone in significant part, not by a rival army that outfought them, but by a currency policy that outran their own restraint. The single most feared fighting force in medieval history, men who could reportedly ride for days without stopping, who conquered walled cities considered functionally impregnable, who terrified populations from Korea to Hungary, got beaten by inflation. There's a very specific kind of dark comedy in that. You can build the most terrifying military machine the world has ever seen, conquer roughly a quarter of the known world, and still lose the whole thing because somebody in the Treasury Department couldn't stop hitting print. Genghis Khan's grandson didn't lose China on a battlefield. He lost it at printing press, one devalued note at a time. Strip away the individual khanates and the individual currencies, and the underlying mechanism here is strikingly simple and strikingly familiar to anyone who studied currency collapses in any era of history. A government built its entire revenue model on a source of income, territorial conquest, that had a hard ceiling. Once that ceiling was reached, ongoing expenses didn't shrink to match. If anything, they grew, as administering and defending a mature empire is expensive in ways that a rapidly expanding one, funded by fresh plunder, simply isn't. Faced with that gap, rather than raising sustainable tax revenue through a growing, trusted economy, which requires patience, institutional stability, and time the yuan government increasingly didn't have, the state reached the fastest available lever, printing more currency. That lever works exactly once, briefly, before the population figures out what's happening, and the currency's value collapses to match the reality of how much of it now exists. And once currency collapses, government legitimacy tends to collapse alongside it, because for most people throughout history, the most immediate, tangible way they experience their government's competence isn't through grand policy. It's through whether the money in their pocket still buys what it bought yesterday. The Mongol Empire at its absolute height was larger than the Roman Empire, the British Empire at its peak, and the Soviet Union all managed to become, and it achieved that scale in a fraction of the time any of those empires took to build theirs. It is, by almost any measure of pure territorial conquest, the single greatest military achievement in human history. And it still went broke. Not because anyone defeated it in open battle at the imperial level, but because an empire built entirely on the assumption of endless expansion had absolutely no functioning plan for what happens once expansion stops. And when the bill finally came due, the solution they reached for was the same one that has broken governments before and since. Print now, worry about the consequences later. The lesson here isn't really about horses or bows, or even about medieval China specifically. It's that the most dangerous threat to the most powerful entity in the world was never going to be a rival army bold enough to challenge it directly. It was always going to be arithmetic. Arithmetic doesn't care how many cities you've conquered. It just waits patiently for the bill.